At 73, William Harris thought he had already faced the hardest storms of life. He had buried his wife, endured decades of back-breaking work as a construction foreman, and raised 3 children under one modest roof in Ohio. But nothing could prepare him for the moment his youngest son, Daniel Harris, stood in front of him with arms crossed and a voice as cold as steel. "Dad, you can't live here anymore. We need the space. Mariana's parents are moving in." The words didn't just land like a blow, they tore through William's chest. In a single breath, the son he had sacrificed everything for turned his back on him. As Daniel's in-laws walked in carrying suitcases, William was forced to gather a small duffel bag, stepping quietly out the back door of the very house he had built with his own hands. To them, it was just a practical decision. To William, it was betrayal. The walls of that home still held memories of his children's laughter, Christmas mornings by the fireplace, and backyard barbecues with neighbors. And yet, in the blink of an eye, he was treated like an old piece of furniture, discarded, forgotten. But Daniel had overlooked one critical detail. The house wasn't his. The deed was still in William Harris's name. This father, though weary, though wounded, was far from finished. William Harris stepped off the back porch with his shoulders heavy, clutching a worn duffel bag that barely held a change of clothes and a few personal papers. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear the laughter of strangers Mariana's parents already making, themselves at home in the very house where he had once read bedtime stories to his children. It wasn't anger that struck him first. It was the silence inside his chest. The kind that comes when someone you love tells you without hesitation that you no longer matter. William had survived long shifts pouring concrete in the blazing Ohio summers, nights when his hands bled, from brickwork winters, when the cold air cut through his lungs. But this, being told by his own flesh and blood that he was no longer welcome, was the hardest blow of all. He walked down the gravel path, each step slower than the last, as though his legs were refusing to carry him away from the place he had built board by board. He thought of the Christmas mornings when Daniel tore open presents on that living room carpet. He remembered his wife standing at the kitchen stove, apron dusted with flour, humming along to Patsy Cline. Those memories weren't just photographs. In his mind, they were part of the very walls Daniel had now claimed for someone else. When William reached the end of the driveway, he stopped. He turned back, hoping maybe, just maybe, that his son would appear at the door, regret written on his face. But the door stank shut, and that was the moment the truth sank in. To Daniel, he wasn't a father anymore. He was an obstacle. It is a strange kind of pain when a parent realizes their child sees them as a burden. William wasn't lazy, wasn't helpless, could still fix a leaky faucet, still mow the yard, still drive himself to church every Sunday. Yet none of that mattered. In Daniel's eyes, he was simply taking up space. That night, William found shelter with an old friend, Henry Miller, a man he had worked construction with back in the 70s. Henry didn't ask questions, just pulled out a spare blanket, brewed a pot of coffee, and let William sit in silence at the kitchen table. It was the kind of silence only old friends know how to share, the kind that doesn't demand explanations. Just presence, as William lay on Henry's creaky sofa, staring at the ceiling fan turning above him. His mind replayed the moment on the porch again and again. His son's voice, flat, unshaken, echoed, like a hammer on steel. "Dad, you can't live here anymore." Each time the words returned, William clenched his fists, not from rage, but from the hollowness they left behind. And yet under that hollowness, something else stirred. A flicker of memory. The envelope tucked in the bottom of his bag. The property deed. The house wasn't Daniel's to give away. It had always remained under William's name because years ago, when he handed his son the keys, he told him, "When you're ready to be responsible, it will be yours." That small decision, made out of caution, stood as a lifeline. Lying there in the dark, William realized something his son had forgotten. Dignity doesn't age. Respect isn't optional. He wasn't just an old man with nowhere to go. He was the man who built that home. The man whose sweat still lived in the walls. By morning, the sorrow inside him had hardened into resolve. He rose early, tied his boots, and poured himself a mug of Henry's strong black coffee. The The pain of betrayal was still there, but so was a new clarity. He wouldn't beg, he wouldn't shout. He would let the truth, the law, the deed, the years of sacrifice speak louder than his son's cruelty. As he folded the deed back into his jacket pocket, William whispered something only the walls of that small farmhouse could hear. "I may be old, but I'm not done yet." And with that, he stepped out into the crisp Ohio morning, the gravel crunching beneath his boots, ready to reclaim not just a house, but the dignity his son had tried to strip away. The next morning, William Harris drove into town with a determination he hadn't felt in years. The courthouse was a familiar brick building that had stood in the center of the county square since before he was born. He had passed it countless times without ever needing to walk inside. But now, each step up those stone stairs carried the weight of his entire life. Inside, the clerk behind the counter looked up, her eyes softening with recognition. William had repaired her father's porch 20 years earlier. "Mr. Harris," she said kindly, "what can I help you with?" His voice was steady, though his hands tightened around the strap of his bag. "I need a current copy of the deed to my house." The woman tapped at her keyboard, then disappeared into a back room. Minutes later, she returned with a crisp sheet of paper, stamped and sealed. William unfolded it slowly, like a man opening a letter from the past, and there it was. Printed in black and white. Owner of record, William L. Harris. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The weight on his chest eased, replaced by a quiet fire. His son could push him out the door, but he couldn't erase his name from the truth. That house, the beams, the bricks, the land, it was still his. William stepped back into the cool morning air and stood on the courthouse steps. For the first time since Daniel's words had cut him down, he felt steady. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer defined him. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't forgotten. He had proof in his hand that reminded him exactly who he was: the builder, the provider, the man who had never walked away from responsibility. Driving back to Henry Miller's farmhouse, William thought about the irony of it all. Years ago, when Daniel begged for help to start his family, William had given him everything, till his money, even the land, to build on. But he had made one condition. The deed would remain in William's name until Daniel proved he could handle the responsibility. At the time, it was meant as a safety net. Now, it felt like a message from his younger self, warning him not to hand over his legacy too easily. That night, William sat at Henry's kitchen table, the deed lying between them. Henry studied it, then leaned back with a slow nod. "You've still got the power, Bill. Don't let anyone make you forget that." William sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. "I don't want revenge," he said quietly. "I just want what's right. A man should be thrown out of the house he built." The next day, William met with an attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Margaret Steele. She listened intently as William explained what happened, her expression tightening at the edges. When he slid the deed across her desk, she tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice firm, "your son and his in-laws are trespassing. You have every right to reclaim your home. I promise you, the law will back you up." Hearing those words sent a shiver through William's spine. For weeks he had felt invisible, discarded like yesterday's newspaper. Now, for the first time, he realized he wasn't standing alone. The law was on his side. Margaret outlined the steps. File a petition for eviction. Let the sheriff serve the notice. Allow the process to unfold. It wouldn't be immediate, but it would be decisive. William nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. This wasn't about punishing his son. It was about protecting the dignity he refused to let slip away. Later that evening, as he walked the quiet gravel road outside Henry's house, the papers folded neatly in his jacket, William whispered to himself, "Respect is earned, not begged for." The stars above Ohio were clear, the air crisp with the scent of fall leaves. And though his heart still ached for the boy who once called him Dad with pride, William understood something vital. He had not lost everything. He still had his name, his integrity, and the wisdom to stand firm. The house would return to him. That much was certain. But more importantly, so would his sense of self, the unshakable truth that a father may grow old, but he never loses the right to be treated with respect. That evening, William Harris sat, In the worn wooden chair by Henry Miller's kitchen window, staring out at the fading orange of the Ohio sunset, the courthouse papers rested on the table, their official seals glinting under the light. They were more than just documents, they were a reminder that he still had ground to stand on. Yet William didn't feel triumph. What he felt was something quieter, heavier: resolve. He had been a man of action all his life. When the roof leaked, he climbed up and patched it. When the car broke down, he rolled under it with a wrench. When his wife grew sick, he worked double shifts to pay the bills without complaint. Was never his way doing was. And so, in this moment, when betrayal might have tempted another man to scream or curse, William chose silence. Not weakness, but discipline. Henry poured him another cup of coffee, setting it down with a soft clink. "You're not the type to sit still, Bill. What are you thinking?" William studied the steam rising from the cup before answering. "I'm thinking. You don't have to raise your voice when the truth is already on your side. My boy forgot that. Maybe it's time he remembered." Those words weren't angry. They were steady, like a foundation laid firm and deep. The next morning, William took a quiet walk down Main Street. He passed the diner, where he and his wife used to share pie after church. He stopped by the hardware store, running his fingers along the handles of tools he had once bought for Daniel, tools meant to build a future. Every corner of town carried echoes of a life well lived, and yet he felt the sting of being treated as though none of it mattered anymore. Still, as he walked, he also felt something shifting inside him. The bitterness was giving way to clarity. He wasn't just fighting for a roof and four walls. He was fighting for the dignity of every parent who had ever sacrificed, only to be discarded. His story, though painful, was bigger than himself. That night, while Henry snored softly in the next room, William spread out his papers on the kitchen table. The deed, the petition, every note his attorney had given him. He organized them carefully. Tucking them into a folder he labeled in his own handwriting, proof. It wasn't revenge he was preparing, it was justice. Plain and simple. For the first time in weeks, William slept soundly. 3 days later, Margaret Steele, his attorney, called with an update. "Mr. Harris, the petition has been filed. The sheriff will serve notice within the week." William thanked her, his voice calm. After hanging up, he stepped outside, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The trees along the gravel road were turning gold, leaves scattering with each gust. Life, he thought, has a way of shedding what no longer belongs, so something new can grow. Later, at the farmhouse, Henry noticed the steadiness in William's eyes. "You're different, Bill, like a man who's carrying a lighter load." William nodded. "Because I've decided something. I'm not going to waste my breath arguing. Let the law speak for me. Let the papers speak for me. Let my silence remind him that I am not broken." The quiet resolve in his words carried more weight than any shouting match ever could, and yet, deep inside, William knew this wasn't just about winning back his home. It was about setting a boundary, one that his son and perhaps others had thought he was too old, too weak to set. But age hadn't stolen his backbone, yet betrayal hadn't erased his worth. That evening, as he stood on Henry's porch watching the stars appear one by one, Liam whispered something to himself that no one else could hear. Respect doesn't come with age. Respect comes when you refuse to let anyone strip it away. And with that, the old builder, once cast aside like yesterday's news, prepared to reclaim not only his house, but his rightful place as a man who still mattered. The following week unfolded like a quiet storm. William Harris didn't raise his voice, didn't march back to the house demanding answers. Instead, he let the process move forward paper by paper, step by step. His attorney, Margaret Steele, kept him updated with calm precision. "Mr. Harris," she explained, "once the sheriff delivers the eviction notice, your son will have a set number of days to leave the property. You won't need to confront him yourself. The law will handle it." William listened, nodding slowly. He wasn't a man who put much faith in lawyers before, but Margaret had earned his trust. She spoke with the same firmness he once heard on job sites when a foreman made sure everyone followed the blueprint. It was a language he understood, clear, direct, and undeniable. When the sheriff finally called, William was sitting on Henry Miller's porch, watching the last of the autumn leaves scatter across the yard. The voice on the line was matter of fact. "Mr. Harris, the eviction order has been signed. We'll be serving notice at your residence in 3 days." William thanked him politely, though his heart thumped heavier in his chest. This was it, the moment his son would learn the truth. Not through shouting, not through fists slammed on a table, but through the weight of an official envelope stamped with his father's name. That night, sleep didn't come easily. William lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering birthdays celebrated in that house, Christmas lights strung across the porch, and the laughter of children running barefoot through the yard. Now strangers were sleeping under that roof, and his own son had pushed him out. He closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "It's not revenge. It's setting things right." 3 days later, the sheriff's deputy knocked on the front door of William's home. William wasn't there to see it. He had chosen not to be. Didn't want to watch his son's face as the envelope was delivered. But he could picture it. Daniel opening the door, expecting a delivery or a neighbor, only to see an officer holding papers that bore one unmistakable name: William L. Harris. Word travels fast in a small town. By the following afternoon, Henry told him he'd already heard whispers from neighbors. "You say your boy's in shock," Henry reported. William only nodded. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. Instead, he sat quietly at the table, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. A few hours later, his phone buzzed. It was Daniel. The first call William ignored. The second and third, too. Then came the messages, first angry, then pleading. "Dad, how could you do this? Where are we supposed to go? You're leaving us with nothing." But in all those words, there was not one apology, not one acknowledgement of the betrayal. William read each message slowly, then set the phone down. He wouldn't answer, not yet, maybe not ever. The following morning, William returned to the house for the first time since being pushed out. He walked up the front steps carefully, as though entering a place both familiar and foreign. The yard was littered with trash bags. The rose bushes his late wife had loved were brown and withered. Inside, he found boxes half-packed, furniture shifted, and walls bare of the family photos he had once hung with pride. In the back hallway, he paused. There, leaning against the wall, was an old wooden chair, the very one he used to sit in when reading the newspaper after work. It was the only thing left untouched. William sat down slowly, the wood creaking under his weight, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of the moment. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even relieved. What he felt was deeper than both. A quiet. "Justice," he whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear it. This was never about winning. It was about remembering that I still matter. For the first time in weeks, William felt his chest loosen. The house would soon be his again, not as a symbol of control, but as proof that dignity doesn't crumble just because others forget. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the sorrow and the silence, he knew this was only the beginning. Because reclaiming the house was one thing. Reclaiming his peace, that would take a different kind of courage. When the sheriff's notice had been delivered and the dust began to settle, William Harris found himself walking back into his house for the first time in months. He had expected to feel triumphant, maybe even vindicated. Instead, what washed over him was something far heavier: memory. The door creaked as he stepped inside. The living room, once filled with the chatter of children and the hum of his late wife's favorite country songs on the radio, now echoed with emptiness. The walls were bare, stripped of the family photos that had once captured birthdays, graduations, and Christmas mornings. In their place hung generic Prince-cold landscapes, store-bought art with no story behind them. William's chest tightened. This isn't my home, not yet, he thought. He walked slowly through the house, his boots pressing against the wooden floor he'd laid down himself 40 years earlier. Every step carried a memory. He could almost see Daniel as a little boy racing toy trucks along the baseboards. He could almost hear the sound of his daughter's laughter drifting from the kitchen, where her mother taught her how to bake pies from scratch. Each ghost of the past felt alive, tugging at him, reminding him of what once had been. When he reached the dining room, he stopped. That table, though scratched and worn, had seen decades of Sunday suppers. He remembered carving the Thanksgiving turkey while the kids fought over who would get the wishbone. Now the table sat pushed against the wall, covered with unopened mail and fast food wrappers. The sight stung more than the betrayal itself. They didn't just push me out, William thought. They erased what this house once meant. He pressed his palm against the edge of the table, closing his eyes. For a moment, he felt as though he might crumble under the weight of it all. But then he remembered something his wife once told him during their hardest years. "You don't let the world decide what home means, Bill. You decide that yourself." Her voice steadied him. Asterisk, he moved down the hallway, pausing outside. What used to be his bedroom. When he opened the door, he found it had been converted into an office cold, impersonal. With no trace of the man who once knelt by that bed to pray after long days of work. He lowered himself into the old wooden chair that had survived the changes. As it creaked beneath his weight, William let the tears come. Not out of weakness, but out of love for everything he had given, and for the simple truth that none of it had been valued by the very son he trusted most. He sat there for a long while, staring at the blank walls, letting the silence do what words never could. And in that silence, something shifted. He realized he couldn't bring back what was lost. The boy who once called him a hero was gone, replaced by a man who chose convenience over blood. But William was still here. And as long as he was, this house still had a heartbeat. Later that evening, opened the windows wide, letting in the crisp autumn air. The scent of dry leaves and wood smoke drifted inside, mixing with the faint echo of memories. He began picking up trash, folding stray blankets, and sweeping the floors. Each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of himself by the time he finally sat down again. The house looked no less worn, but the heaviness inside it had lifted just a little. He whispered softly, almost like a prayer. "You didn't destroy this place, Daniel. You just forgot what it meant. But I'll remind you, even if you never come back to see it." That night, William slept in his own bed, or rather in the space that had once been his. The mattress was gone, replaced with only the old chair. But he slept anyway, because the roof above him, the beams, the very ground beneath his feet, were still his, and though the ghosts of family memories would always linger, William understood that he had a choice, to let them haunt him or to let them guide him toward rebuilding. He chose rebuilding. The eviction notice had run its course. The day finally came when William Harris knew his son would have to leave. He didn't plan to be there. He had no desire to watch his son scramble. No appetite for shouting matches or slammed doors. But fate has its way of pulling us into moments we'd rather avoid. As William turned onto his street, he saw the front yard cluttered with boxes and suitcases. His daughter-in-law stood on the porch, pale and tense, while her parents shuffled in and out with their belongings. The house that once rang with laughter now looked like a storm had passed through. William stopped at the edge of the walkway, his boots crunching against the gravel. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was louder than any curse. He could have shouted. A few minutes later, Daniel appeared in the doorway. His shoulders sagged, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling as he carried out the last of their bags. For a brief moment, William saw not the man who had betrayed him, but the little boy who once ran barefoot across that very yard, calling, "Daddy, wait for me." The memory hit him like a punch to the chest, but the boy was gone. What stood before him was a man who had chosen pride over gratitude, convenience over family. As Daniel brushed past him with a suitcase dragging on the pavement, he muttered almost under his breath, "You went too far, Dad." William turned his head slowly, his voice calm but steady, each word sharpened by truth. "No, son, you went too far first." The weight of those words hung in the air. Daniel flinched, but didn't answer. He kept walking, the wheels of his suitcase rattling against the uneven sidewalk until the sound faded into nothing. William stood there a while longer, staring at the house. The walls still carried scars, the yard still bore neglect, but the space was his again. He wasn't proud of what had unfolded, Yet he knew it was necessary. Because sometimes silence teaches the harshest lesson one no amount of pleading or yelling ever could. Inside, the house felt hollow. William wandered through the rooms, each corner holding fragments of a life he once lived with joy. He saw the bare nails on the walls where family portraits used to hang, the faint marks where his wife's rocking chair once stood. In the emptiness, he whispered to himself, "It's not the walls that break you, it's forgetting who built them." That evening, he sat on the porch with a blanket draped over his shoulders. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, as though everyone else knew something sacred had just shifted. He thought of Daniel, of the life his son had chosen, and of the gap that now stretched between them. He didn't feel vengeance. He felt something colder, yet truer. Closure later, as the sun dipped low and the air turned crisp, William lit a lantern on the porch. Its glow reached just far enough to cast a circle of light around him. "Let this be the reminder," he murmured, "that respect isn't demand, it's earned. And when it's thrown away, sometimes silence is the only answer left." Leaned back, listening to the night sounds, the crickets, the rustle of dry leaves in the wind, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Ordinary noises, but to William they sounded like peace returning, slow but steady. He knew Daniel might never understand the lesson, at least not now. But the house, the silence, the very air around them would carry it. And someday, when regret weighed heavier than pride, his son would remember the day he walked away with nothing but a suitcase, and his father's words echoing behind him. William didn't smile. He didn't frown. Simply sat there, a man weathered by life but unbroken, letting the quiet deliver the lesson his voice no longer needed to give. The house was quiet again, too quiet. After Daniel and his family had gone, William Harris walked the rooms like a man sifting through the ashes of a fire. The structure still stood, but something inside had burned away. Some evenings he'd sit on the porch, lantern glowing at his side, and wonder if this silence was all he had left. Then one Saturday afternoon, while William was trimming back the weeds that had taken over his wife's old flower bed, he heard footsteps on the gravel. He looked up, expecting perhaps a neighbor or worse, Daniel returning with more anger in his eyes. But instead it was a boy with a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hi, Grandpa," came a soft voice. It was Ethan, Daniel's 15-year-old son. The boy looked uncertain, his sneakers scuffed, his hair falling into his eyes. William felt a rush of warmth and sorrow all at once. He set down his garden shears and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Well," he said gently, "you came all this way. Don't just stand there, come sit." They sat beneath the shade of the porch, neither speaking much at first. Ethan fidgeted with the zipper of his backpack, clearly working up the courage to say something more. William, patient as ever, let the silence stretch. Finally, the boy sighed. "Dad, it's not doing good," Ethan admitted. "Talks about you all the time. Not mad, just ashamed, I think." He won't say it out loud, but I can tell. William's heart clenched. Shame was a heavy burden, but one his son had chosen to carry. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Your father made choices, son. Choices have consequences. That's life. But none of this is your fault." The boy's eyes glistened, and for a moment William worried he might cry. Instead, Ethan straightened his back, meeting his grandfather's gaze. "I just don't want to lose you too." That pierced deeper than any words Daniel had thrown at him. William pulled his grandson into a hug, strong, steady, the kind of hug that said, "You are safe here." From that day on, Ethan became a regular presence in William's life. He'd drop by after school with stories about classes and friends. Sometimes he brought small gifts and old baseball he'd found, drawing from art class. Once even a pie he had clumsily baked with his mother's help. Each gesture stitched together a little more of the wound William carried. One evening, while they sat on the porch watching fireflies, Ethan said something that William would never forget. "Grandpa, you didn't just stand up for yourself. You showed me what dignity looks like. I'll never forget that." William turned to him, searching his face. The boy's words weren't dramatic, but they were true, spoken with the kind of sincerity only youth can carry. For the first time since the betrayal, William felt a deep sense of peace. Maybe he hadn't lost everything after all. Later that week, William called his attorney. He wanted to update his will. Margaret Steele asked who the new heir would be. William didn't hesitate. "My grandson Ethan," he said firmly. "He's the one who remembers what family is supposed to mean." That decision wasn't made out of spite. It was made out of hope that someday, long after he was gone, Ethan would walk through this house and know it wasn't just bricks and beams. It was proof that respect matters, that love without honor isn't love at all. As autumn deepened, William often found himself smiling when Ethan's footsteps sounded on the porch. The boy would sit down, pull out his homework, and talk while William tended the garden. In those moments, William realized something powerful. Betrayal may cut deep, but the light of even one honest heart can begin to heal the wound. And for William Harris, that light was his grandson. Winter had settled over Ohio by the time Daniel finally returned. The trees outside William Harris's house were stripped bare, their branches rattling in the cold wind. Inside, the warmth of the wood stove filled the living room where William sat in his favorite chair. A blanket draped over his knees, listening to the steady tick of the old wall clock. Asterisk, he wasn't expecting company that night, but then came 3 slow knocks at the door. Not rushed, not angry, measured. William rose carefully, every bone in his body reminding him of his 73 years, and opened the door. Asterisk, there stood Daniel. He looked thinner, worn down. His eyes no longer carried the arrogance that once cut like a blade. Instead, they carried something William hadn't seen in years in certainty. "Dad," Daniel said softly, "can I come in?" William didn't answer right away. He studied his son the way a carpenter studies a crooked beam, deciding whether it could be set straight or if it was too far gone. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come on," he said simply. Daniel sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped tightly together. He glanced around the room as though it were foreign to him, though he'd spent half his life within these walls. His voice broke the silence. "I didn't come here to ask for anything. I can't carry this anymore." William settled back into his chair, his face unreadable. "Then say what you need to say." Daniel swallowed hard. "I made the choice to put you out. No one forced me. Not Mariana, not her parents. It was me. I thought I was doing the right thing, making space for my family. But every night since, I see you walking down that driveway with nothing but a bag. I see the look on your face, and I hate myself for it." For the first time, William's eyes softened, though only slightly. He had waited months for these words, yet hearing them brought no joy, only a deep ache. He raised a hand gently, stopping his son before he could continue. "Listen, Daniel, what you did wasn't an accident. It wasn't heat of the moment. It was deliberate. You looked me in the eye and decided I didn't belong in the house I built. That's not something words can fix." Daniel's shoulders slumped, stared at the floor like a man waiting for a sentence. "So there's no way back? Not even a chance?" William leaned forward, his voice steady, almost fatherly again. "There's always a way back for anyone who's willing to rebuild, brick by brick. But that takes more than showing up with guilt. It takes respect. Respect isn't spoken." The room fell silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. For a moment, William thought he saw the boy he once knew, hidden somewhere behind his son's weary eyes. But it faded quickly, replaced by the man who had already crossed a line that could never be erased. At last, Daniel stood. He extended his hand, hesitant. William took it not as a sign of forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. A handshake of closure. "Goodbye, Dad," Daniel murmured. William nodded. "Goodbye, son." No embrace followed, no tears, no dramatic reconciliation. Just 2 men, bound by blood, but divided by choices, parting ways with the quiet knowledge that things might never be the same again. When the door closed behind him, William felt a strange calm wash over him. The final link to the pain of the past months had snapped, not with anger, but with truth. He sank back into his chair, staring into the fire. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't sting. It soothed in, as he pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. William whispered to himself, "Sometimes love means leaving the door closed, not out of hate but out of dignity." The weeks after Daniel's visit passed quietly. The air in William Harris's house seemed lighter, as though the walls themselves had released a long-held breath. Winter was still biting outside, but inside, the fire glowed steady, and the silence was no longer heavy with sorrow. It was a silence of peace. Each morning William rose early. He brewed strong coffee the way his late wife used to like it, buttered a piece of toast, and looked out over the yard. The place had fallen into neglect, but he wasn't discouraged. With every nail he drove back into place, every bush he trimmed, every wall he repainted, was stitching together more than a house. He was restoring himself. On weekends, Ethan often came by. The boy brought warmth that filled the halls more than any photograph ever could. One Saturday, he carried in a stack of old family albums William thought had been lost. "Mom had these," Ethan explained, placing them on the table. As they turned the pages together, William pointed to each picture, telling stories that made Ethan laugh, tales of fishing trips, scraped knees, and Christmas mornings when the gifts were simple, but the joy was full. One evening, as the two of them sat by the fireplace, Ethan asked, "Grandpa, are you going to leave this house to Dad someday?" The question cut deep, but William didn't flinch. He placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "No, son," he said softly. "This house belongs to the one who remembers what it means. And right now, that's you." Ethan's eyes widened. "Me?" William nodded. "Not because you asked for it, because you've shown me respect, loyalty, and love. That's worth more than any deed or dollar." It was a decision William had already made with his attorney, but saying it aloud in that moment felt like placing a cornerstone into a foundation Ethan could stand on for the rest of his life. As the months passed, the house began to transform. The flower beds bloomed again under William's careful hands. The walls were repainted a soft cream, and family photos of his wife and children returned to their places, though this time Ethan's picture stood at the center of the mantel. Neighbors began stopping by, offering kind words. Some called William a stubborn old man, others called him strong. He didn't mind either way. He knew what he was, a man who hadn't given up his dignity. On a crisp spring morning, William planted a rose bush in the front yard, the same kind his wife once adored. As he pressed the soil around the roots, Ethan came up beside him. "Why roses, Grandpa?" William smiled. "'Cause they remind me that beauty comes with thorns. Life does too. Just have to be strong enough to handle both." After Ethan left, William sat at the old kitchen table and opened his journal. A neat handwriting. He wrote, "Legacy isn't money or property, it's the courage to stand tall when others want to see you bend. And if even one soul learns that from me, then I've done my job as a father and as a man." The fire crackled gently as William set down his pen. He leaned back, listening to the night sounds outside, the wind brushing the trees, the soft hoot of an owl. He didn't know how many years he had left, but he knew one thing with certainty. Whatever time remained would be lived on his terms, with his head high and his heart steady, and in that quiet house filled once more with love and memory. William Harris finally felt what he had fought for all along, not just justice, but peace.